Hello, welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Revisited for Assignment Earth. My original review for this episode was uploaded on my channel on April 24th, 2023. So, not that long ago, a bit over a year, because it was part of my normal covering every episode, one episode at a time. It's funny, I've been doing this for that long, but I have. So anyway, I have done polls recently. It was a funny idea to have to do a poll for the original series TNG, DS9, Voyager, and Enterprise, and because I already covered the original series, the poll was for a revisited that I would make public on my channel for everyone to see. Usually my revisiteds are patron-only videos that I put exclusively for patron supporters, but in this case, it's meant to be live and public for everyone to see because it won the poll. This is out of 5 episodes. This is the episode my viewers decided that they wanted to see, and I'll try not to hold this against the viewers for voting for this, because I was hoping I would never have to watch this episode again. And it won't be the last terrible episode I have to watch for the polls, but anyway so this was in my top 25 worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. Granted, it was number 25. So at the bottom, this is something I didn't know at the time when I made this review. A year later, I made the video. I determined because at the time I just had my top 10 worst episodes, and I was like, nah, 10's not good enough. Because I put like a special thumbnail with the inverted color and a little fancy banner, just point out like, hey, this is a bad episode, to differentiate it from all the other episodes, because I thought that was I liked that idea. So I thought 10 wasn't good enough because there's more bad episodes. I should do 25. So I did his own video for 25, but then I went back and all of the reviews, the episodes I've already covered that were in my top 25, I just changed the thumbnail to put the funky, and the title to put, hey, this is also top 25 worst episodes, and changed the thumbnail as well. But new episodes going forward that I hadn't covered yet, they're in my top 25, I will mention in the video, hey, this is part of my top 25, and the title will say top 25 worst episodes. And apparently that's confused some people because they didn't realize it was an episode review. They thought it was a top 25 of something. So I don't know if that's a good idea for me to do, but whatever. that's what I went for. But so this one had already been made, so it didn't mention in the video. It's just after the fact I went and put the thumbnail and changed the title. So it also, in addition to being my number 25 worst episode of the entire franchise, and that is a feat because there's like 1,000 or so episodes in this franchise. Although granted, this top 25 is only for the Legacy track. I didn't include Modern Trek in it, so less than 1,000 episodes. I can't remember what the count is for Legacy track. It's 700 and something or another, or maybe 800. I don't remember. But anyway, maybe 800. But anyway, so not only is it number 25, worst episode of the entire franchise, it was also number 4 in my top 10 most reckless uses of time travel list. I'm very proud of that list. Because, I pointed that this is a totally reckless use of time travel. I believe when I did a user review or user top 10 worse for the original series, this made it on that list as well. I can't remember what number it was. I think maybe it was number 9 or number 10. It was one of the high numbers, but it was on the list. Which I'm about to do one for Next Generation now, because I just finished my coverage of Next Generation, which is why I'm doing these polls. Because I thought, hey, before I continue the rest, once I'm done with Next Generation, let's take a break, do these polls. But anyway, so I don't like this episode, if you couldn't tell. And the main reason for it, well, there's several reasons, really, that I cited in my review. The main reason is that it's a pilot for another show that they shoehorned the original series characters in order to do the pilot, in order to say, hey, this is actually a Star Trek episode, get it? So that they could put it on air, because NBC very rightfully did not give Roddenberry the money to do it as a pilot. And it was written as a pilot. There's a script out there for Assignment Earth as its own thing, but when they couldn't get the money to do the pilot, they're like, let's just shove in Star Trek characters so that we can put it up in the Star Trek. And the thing is, you can fucking tell. Like, you don't need to know this backstory. It's freaking obvious that the Kirk and Spock and the other main characters of Star Trek are pedestrians, or like observers. So that's one reason why I can't stand this episode. The other reason is this is just boring. It is so boring. It's just Kirk and Spock and Gary Seven standing around a launch pad, and it uses all the stock footage of freaking control rooms, like, no, blah, 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 and it's like drags out the episode, and they're sitting there like watching a rocket go, and they play this like very suspenseful music, like da 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 da, and it's just very, very, very boring. Very boring. In addition, well, I guess there's a third reason related to the first reason, is that this pilot, as I mentioned, sucks. So I'm not interested in this, particularly when I'm told this is an episode of Star Trek. If I wanted to watch some random pilots for some random sci-fi show, I would look that shit up. This is now in the pantheon of Star Trek. So all that stuff really irritates the hell out of me. Now, I have gotten a significant amount of pushback on my channel for stating said opinion about how terrible this episode is. And also, I've watched listened to some other podcasts and some other reviews who were very positive on this episode. And I listened to a few of them before recording this video, because I was actually genuinely, I wanted to hear them out. I wanted to hear, what is it about this episode you could possibly like, because I'm a bit lost. And also a couple comments on my video also stated. And so the conclusion that I drew, that the reason that all these people, the comments, the reviews, the podcast, they all seem to pretty much say the same thing of the reasons why they like this episode. And that is, it is a very symbolic, a representative of what the era of the late 60s were like. And how it portrays how nuclear war was around the corner at any time, and how it was very, a poignant issue at the time, and it was a very important issue, and people were rightfully scared, and they thought that the episode pointed to this and brought this to light, and sort of brought out the feeling of how terrifying of a time this was for people. Particularly have Terry Garr's character in this episode saying stuff like, we don't even know if we're going to still be around in 30 years, which is funny because this is now about 57 years ago from when I recorded this podcast. And, Terry Garr very sadly passed away, but fairly recently, so she certainly was around 30 years after the episode aired, and so was that the majority of that generation, unless, something happened to them, did grow up. As I said, like, the world didn't end, which is what she's implying. But it's an interesting sort of time capsule. But here's the thing. I think most of the people I've heard that opinion from are very interested in that era. There was the podcast, The Enterprise Incident. I referenced them a lot as I was going through the original series because I was listening to them lots of times. I almost always disagreed with them. And they loved this episode. But anyway, the point is, they were very interested in what was going on in the times in the 60s. They had a portion of their podcast that was all about what was going on when this episode aired, what was in the news, what was happening with like the Beatles or with politicians and stuff like that. So they're very, very interested in this time period. And then there was another podcast I listened to where one of the podcasters said that they made a documentary about the year 1968. And I can't really speak much for the podcaster, but he seemed very interested in the era as well. And here's the thing. I'm not. I'm in fact, I'm kind of repelled by movies and TV shows about the 60s. And the reason being is because when I grew up in the 90s, the nostalgia kick for the 60s was huge. It seems like every fucking TV show, tons of movies were all about the 60s. You had Forrest Gump, you had the Wonder Years, that was the late 80s, but still. 80s also had a 50s kick with, Back to the Future, and had all these 50s themed restaurants. But in the 90s, it was mostly the 60s. And everything always had to be set in the 60s, and that irritated the fuck out of me. I wasn't alive then. I didn't really care. I couldn't relate to it. And I feel like, and I'm kind of upset that we didn't really get a kick of... I was waiting for them to be a kick of 90s, things set in the 90s. Now, we did get some. But everyone's still focused more on the 80s. They always focus more on the 80s. They got Stranger Things and all this other stuff. There was a huge, huge 80s kick and just a tiny 90s kick. I know there was a few ones. I can't think of them off the top of my head. But there's definitely... Captain Marvel, everyone's making fun of how that was so... had so many 90s references off the wahoo. And I thought... Actually, it wasn't that bad. I could have done with more 90s references if I was... Because we don't get enough. We don't get enough of the 90s stuff. Whereas in the 90s, we got tons and tons and tons of 60s stuff. So I'm kind of not interested in that era because it's kind of over... I was overloaded with it. And now I'm kind of like... Bleh. Obviously, I'm still watching the original series because I'm a Star Trek fan and happened to air in the 60s. And a lot of times I do... point out, hey, this is why this episode was made, because this and such was going on around this time. Like Private Little War was based off of the Vietnam War, and in this episode I even pointed out in my review how it was poignant at the time because nuclear war was just around the corner. So I don't hold it against that it's it's being a sign of the times in which it's made, because it should be. That's what Star Trek is always meant to be. So I don't hold that against it. I just don't, I'm not biased towards it because of it, which in my humble opinion, these other people who do like this episode for that reason are. It's because they're a scholar of that time period that makes them more interested in it. Whereas I think the lay person who is not a scholar of that time period and doesn't have a specific fascination of that time period would not like this episode because it's boring. Now, of course, I don't mean to make a blanket statement. Of course, that doesn't apply to everyone everywhere. There could be scholars of the 60s who hate this episode, and there could be people who don't give a shit about the 60s who love this episode. But in general, based off of my observations of, I don't know what I'm doing with my hands here, but of the pool that I've been seeing, I think that's the case. Because I just wonder, like, how can anyone like this episode? I mean, what? Now, I'd get in an argument with one of my commenters, who's one of my Patreon supporters, still supporting the channel, Chuck Hooks. Always used to get in arguments with her, but he supports my channel, so I'm thankful for that. But, yeah, I got in an argument with him about this episode in particular because, he was sort of questioning and challenging me on why I'm upset that Roddenberry chose to use this as a backdoor pilot. And I think I could have argued my point better. But my main point was that it's not just that it's a backdoor pilot. I'm not against backdoor pilots in general. I even said that in my review, and I pointed out, like, The Outer Limits, they had a couple decent backdoor pilots. And then there's other shows. My sister brought up a show that's more poignant, but I can't think of it at the top of my head. I mean, there's, like, you can't even say, like, Better Call Saul was not a backdoor pilot. Better Call Saul was just a spinoff. I don't know, and I think there's lots of, like, spin-offs, but they're kind of, it's different when you have a supporting character or characters or situation and people think, hey, these are pretty interesting characters, let's make a show off of them. That's not a backdoor pilot. That's different. It's a backdoor pilot is when you totally introduce new characters for one episode and with the intention of making it a pilot. That's a backdoor pilot, and that's different than spinning off side characters that already exist in the show. And I have an issue, and again, not with backdoor pilots in general, but with this one, because it is. And another reviewer, like, put this pretty eloquently that I really liked. He said that it was a fine balance. Doing a backdoor pilot is a tricky balance of trying to introduce the new show that you want to push while honoring the show that is on by making it a good rightful episode of the show that it is. And this episode totally fails at that second part of the balance because this does not at all feel like a Star Trek episode. In fact, I was listening to another review where they were saying, oh, yeah, no, but you can like this episode. It's a good episode. You just got to not think about it as a Star Trek episode. But that's the problem. That's the problem. That for me, that's a ridiculous or a impossible ask. You can't ask for me to look at a Star Trek show as if it isn't a Star Trek episode, because it fucking is a Star Trek episode. Therefore, it needs to be a Star Trek episode. Like, it can also be a backdoor pilot, but it needs to be a Star Trek episode as well. Like, for example, the Maquis. And, I mean, that's not that big of an example, but that episode was specifically made to spin off Voyager. Like, it wasn't like, oh, we already have the Maquis, let's make Voyager based off these characters. That's what Deep Space Nine, to be fair, like, the Bajorans and Cardassians and their conflict already existed, and they were like, hey, let's make a show and let's base it off of these things that already exist. Whereas with Voyager, the Maquis actually didn't already exist. They created it specifically to set up Voyager. They created the episode The Maquis and the Preemptive Strike and Tribunal was all meant to spin off Voyager. But that's fine. I have no issue with that whatsoever, because they feel like Star Trek episodes. The Maquis two-parter feels like a Deep Space Nine episode. Preemptive Strike, well, feels more like a DS9 episode, but also a Next Generation episode. But I love that episode. So yeah, so I have no issue with if you're gonna purposely set up another show, but you gotta make it feel like it's part of the show. And this episode absolutely fails. The Kirk and Spock very obviously shoehorned into the script, and all they do is stand around, and eventually it's like, oh, and the only tension in this episode is fucking Kirk trying to stop them. And oh, should I let Gary Seven do it? Should I not let him do it? Oh, I don't know if I can let you do it. And then at the end, Gary Seven's like, trust me, let me do it. And they're like, okay, you can do it. And he saves the day. Like, that's not a fucking plot. That's not a story. Like, and I don't get why people would, even if you're a scholar of the 60s, I don't get why you find people standing around in a control room where we get stock footage of control rooms and fucking rockets taking up like 20 minutes of the goddamn episode, and they're just standing around watching stuff happening. How is that interesting? Even if you're a scholar of the 60s, how the hell is that interesting? Like, I don't get it. I don't get it. But, yeah. Couple of one little nitpick I noticed about this episode after just watching it is there's, towards the end, Terry Garr, I don't even remember the character's name, just call it Terry Garr, who is quite annoying in this episode. The character, not the actress. The actress is fine, but the character was just written terribly. But anyway, and plus she had a terrible experience with Roddenberry, who was creeping on her. Apparently she hated the Star Trek because of it, but anyway. She, so there's a scene towards the end. Terry Garr, Gary Seven was doing his thing, trying to save the rocket or stop the rocket, explode the rocket or whatever. And she was like, hey, you can't do this, you got to stop doing this. And he just kept ignoring her. And so she like bopped him over the head with this like book, and then, or whatever it was. And then she, stole his little, what do they call it? It's a Doctor Who thing. I didn't even get the reference until someone explained to him. Some kind of screwdriver, magical screwdriver. I can't remember what it's called. I don't watch Doctor Who. I don't give a shit about Doctor Who. But anyway, his little weapon thing, and she stole it from him. And it was like, you stop it right now. And he was trying to convince her. I was like, look, if I don't do this, World War III is going to stop. You got to let me do it. And then Kirk and Spock show up, and they hold phasers at Gary Seven, and they're like, okay, step away from the machine. You can't, interfere with the missile. And then Terry Garr all of a sudden goes, but you have to let him do it. Like, what? What? That doesn't make any sense. She's like 100% like threatening to kill Gary Seven. Is like, you step the hell away from it. And then Kirk and Spock show up there like, no, let him do it. What? Like, what? Such a poorly written episode. Anyway. And the other thing I was noted as a cat lover, that cat is, all the sounds that it makes was recorded by a human being. I think those are not the kind of sounds that cat makes. I can guarantee you that it was a human being imitating cat sounds. And because it doesn't, it's not even, and it makes all these sounds like too often. Like, cats don't like make those sounds that much, and especially like when the cat was attacking, like that did not sound at all like what a cat sounds like when it attacks someone. It was just going. It was definitely some dude in the booth, like just making weird noises with his mouth. It's freaking obvious. Or it could have been a woman, as far as I know, but it was a person. It was a human being. My point, it was not a cat. Why did they get cat sounds? Like, it's Anyway, and most of the time, the cat was a puppet. That was pretty obvious. I mean, sometimes it wasn't. Not that I begrudge the original series. I know it's hard to work with animals, and it's the 60s. Their puppets aren't going to look the best. It's actually fairly good, like, for the most part. It wasn't complete crap. So it was okay. But yeah, the sound is the thing I had the bigger issue with. But yeah. So yeah, most of this other stuff about the episode I did cover in my original review about how this is not interesting. It's not the type of show I would watch. And this is what pisses me off. This is what frustrates me. It's forcing me to watch it because they shoved it into Star Trek where it didn't belong. Like, it's just... And it's so obvious. It's such a poorly made, like, barely fits the theme of Star Trek, and it's beyond obvious that they shoved in the characters. And that's why it bothers me. Like, it was when I was arguing with the person, it's like, oh, why do you begrudge Roddenberry trying to sell his show? I was like, and my response, I don't care. I don't begrudge him that at all. He can go ahead and try to sell his shows. He can even put it into Star Trek if he wants, but it has to fucking honor Star Trek. You can't just shove it in there and shove Kirk and Spock into the script at the last second and say this is a Star Trek episode. No, it fucking isn't. And by the way, Reckless time travel is about them just traveling back to the 20th century for no reason. For no reason. This is one of the worst examples of time travel. And on the topic of time travel, I did this video a couple years ago where I was analyzing the different types of time travel in Star Trek, and I broke it down between type 1, which is the whatever happened, time travel, type 2, which is the most common one. You go back, you change something, and it alters the timeline, so the one and only timeline is now different, and you have to go back and fix whatever you changed so you can restore the one and only timeline. And then, which is the main type of time travel that Star Trek uses. And then there's type 3, which is irrelevant here, about Star Trek 2009 bullshit, other worlds. And I was placing every episode into one of those 3 categories, and I put this episode into type 2 time travel, and after watching it, I realized I was wrong. I was actually wrong to do that. It's probably because at the time I made the video, I hadn't seen this episode in a while, and I hate this episode, so I don't really remember it that well. It's not something I like to watch, as I, just brought up earlier. But after just watching it, I realized that they're saying it's type 1 time travel. They're saying it's the whatever happened meant to happen, because Kirk is saying, oh, our history recorded that this missile thingy always happens, so we were meant to be here to fuck around with you. Like, I don't even follow Kirk's logic, but according to him, and I think it's, again, a sign of a very sloppily written script. Very bad written, very poorly written script. To just throw in, oh yeah, by the way, this is always what meant to happen. Let's just get the hell out of here with this shit. And I never really like when Star Trek does type 1 time travel, because it's firmly established they're type 2. So whenever they say they're type 1, that it goes against what has been established. And that's the rule with time travel logic. You make a rule and you stick with it. Don't even get me started with Prodigy Season 2 did with those whole Langoliers bullshit, which just absolutely goes completely outside of what Star Trek had established time travel. But then again, so does Star Trek 2009. They just wanted an excuse to do a fucking reboot and wipe canon away so they could do whatever the fuck they want. But anyway, cash grab bullshit, that's all that is. But anyway, my original rating for Assignment Earth out of 10 was a 1, the worst, and of course, very obviously, I'm sticking to that 1. And yeah, I am also sticking to this being number 25, worst episode of the entire franchise. 100% I'm sticking to that. It's not very many redeeming qualities to this. I'm sorry, just mentioning the nuclear scare in the 60s to me is not a good quality. Like, if you want to make a good episode about that and actually explore that in a meaningful way with good character stories, I'm on board. Like, I'm not a hater of the 60s. Like, if you do something about the 60s, but you make it very interesting and you know, be poignant about the time and you have good characters and stuff, I'm totally fine with that. What I think is that people who like this episode are giving it a pass on all of its terrible flaws. And the fact that it doesn't actually have a decent plot, it shoehorns Kirk and Spock in, and the majority of the episode is just them standing around looking at a control room or watching a missile go. And they're ignoring all this shit just because, it's about the 60s nuclear race. Anyway, so that is it for my revisited of Assignment Earth. Alright, so let's see what's coming up next on my channel here. Continuing the poll winners, Monday will be another revisited, this time revisiting my review for Data Lore. And once again, this will be public on my channel for everyone to see. Part of the poll winners is the Next Generation poll winner. Beginning to the next poll winner, some new reviews. On Wednesday, I'll be reviewing Way of the Warrior. On Thursday, I'll be reviewing Course of Oblivion. And on Saturday, have me reviewing Acquisition. Which means I gotta watch it twice now, because I'm gonna watch it now for this review and then later when I revisit it. So, yeah. But anyway, that's what's coming up on my channel, so be sure to check it out as I continue to cover Star Trek. Once I'm done with these poll winners, we'll be getting straight into Season 3 of DS9. So yeah, be sure to check me out for that, and if you really want to support the channel, you can support me on Patreon, where you get tons more of these revisiteds. And many other perks as well. And if that's not your thing, Patreon's not your thing, you can still support the channel if you want by leaving a like, subscribing, commenting. All that stuff really helps me out. So yeah, please check me out as I continue to cover Star Trek, and be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.